In the winter of 2022, a mom in her mid-30s sat in the bleachers at the local ice hockey rink, cheering on her 6-year-old son. She always enjoyed watching these hockey games. The kids were adorable as they slipped around the ice, trying to control the hockey puck. Her son was small for his age. He was so tiny, she almost hadn't signed him up for the team again this year. But he loved hockey and his teammates, so she didn't have the heart to say no. The mom clapped and hollered when her son got the puck and started skating toward the opposite goal. Then he swung his stick and the puck went sailing past the other team's goalie. Her son threw his arms up in celebration, and then he suddenly crumpled to the ice in pain. Fear ran through the mother as she heard her son's wail. Nobody had touched him. All he'd done was swing a stick and raise his arms. But he was crying so hard, it was like he'd broken a bone or cracked his head open on the ice. The referee skated over to the boy to see what was wrong as the mother raced down the bleachers to her son's side. She didn't know if she should call him an ambulance or just tell him to snap out of it. But judging from how loud he was screaming, the pain he was feeling was very real. From Ballin Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballin, and this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new, baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. So if you like today's story, the next time you're in the Follow Button's house, secretly replace all the pictures hanging up on their walls with a slice of square cheese. This episode is called 17 Doctors. During the COVID-19 lockdown in 2020, Caroline Daniels stood in her backyard in suburban Iowa, watching her husband, Brian, blow up a small bouncy house that she just bought on Amazon. Brian had nearly gotten the thing inflated. They'd all been cooped up in the house for over a month because of the pandemic, so it was a godsend that the weather was nice and they'd gotten something fun for the kids to do outside. The moment the bouncy house was inflated, Andrew and Robin went running to it and piled inside with their dad. They screamed and giggled as their father bounced around them, launching them a few feet into the air every time. Caroline smiled and went back into the kitchen, where their nanny was cutting up some veggie sticks for a snack. She was about to grab a knife and help when the screaming outside turned from fun to painful. Caroline dashed back outside and found her husband kneeling next to Andrew. The little 4-year-old was curled up on his side, sobbing with pain. Caroline helped Brian scoop Andrew into his arms, then followed them inside. Brian laid Andrew on the sofa in the living room so that he and Caroline could try to figure out if the boy had any broken bones. But after a minute of prodding, Caroline felt sure that nothing was seriously wrong. Besides, Brian assured her that Andrew hadn't landed hard or anything. He just bounced a little, then started screaming. This whole situation definitely seemed odd, but Caroline assumed that, he must have just landed at an odd angle or something. She gave him some Motrin to help with the pain, and after a few minutes, Andrew did calm down. And by dinner time, he was back to his usual happy-go-lucky self. By the following morning, Caroline had put the whole bouncy house incident out of her mind. She left Brian watching the kids while she hopped on a morning Zoom call for work. Halfway through the call, though, Caroline heard a piercing scream in the yard. It was Andrew again. She turned off her camera and raced downstairs. By the time she got to the backyard, the nanny was kneeling beside Andrew, who was once again in the fetal position and crying. Caroline asked if Andrew had fallen down, but the nanny said no. He was just standing there, and then he suddenly yelped and fell to the ground, and Andrew had been crying ever since. Caroline couldn't tell if Andrew was truly in pain or if he was just having a meltdown. She picked up her son and asked what was wrong, but it was clear he was in no mood to talk. He just cried. Caroline wasn't sure what to make of it. Andrew was not the kind of little boy to throw temper tantrums, but she also knew that every child gets overwhelmed sometimes. Besides, he hadn't seen his friends in months because of the COVID lockdown, and he was tired of being at home all the time, and so Caroline decided he must just be having a moment. Still, she gave him another Motrin, and about 15 minutes later, Andrew was back to normal. It suddenly occurred to Caroline that Andrew's molars might be coming in, which could be extremely painful. Once he was outside playing with the nanny again, she picked up the phone to call his dentist. A few weeks later, an orthodontist named Dr. Tyson Graham sat down on a stool in his treatment room, and turned to face little Andrew, who was sitting up in the examination chair. Andrew's mom was in the corner, looking anxious. Dr. Graham smiled at her, then explained to Andrew how he was going to try to help the little boy with the pain he'd been experiencing lately. Andrew's regular dentist had already taken x-rays of Andrew's mouth and found that Andrew had been grinding his teeth at night. Teeth grinding can cause difficulty breathing at night, and the dentist thought that might explain why Andrew had been so moody and exhausted recently. He wasn't sleeping well. So the dentist had referred Andrew to Dr. Graham, thinking that the orthodontist might find a way to prevent the boy's teeth grinding. But as Dr. Graham examined Andrew's mouth, he found a different issue. Andrew's palate, the roof of his mouth, was too narrow for his age. In Dr. Graham's opinion, that, not teeth grinding, was what was making it difficult for Andrew to breathe at night. He turned to Caroline and explained that if Andrew had a wider palate, he'd very likely feel better. They could put an expander in Andrew's mouth for a couple of months to push the palate out. Caroline looked nervous, but Dr. Tyson explained that the expander wasn't that different from getting braces, and it would definitely help Andrew breathe better. Caroline still looked unsure, but she agreed. Dr. Graham nodded and then went to get a few supplies to install the palate expander. A month later, Caroline squeezed into the bathroom with Andrew and Robin, squirting little dabs of bubblegum toothpaste onto their toothbrushes. Then all three of them brushed their teeth together, a little bedtime routine they'd fallen into recently. Mostly, this was so Caroline could make sure they actually did it, but it was also to make sure Andrew used the special mouthwash she had bought him to keep his palate expander nice and clean. Caroline was tired, and she could tell her kids were exhausted too. They'd spent all day outside, playing a socially distanced version of hide-and-seek they'd made up with the neighborhood kids. Caroline was glad to see Andrew back to his old self. It seemed like the palate expander had really worked. As the kids got into their pajamas, Andrew asked if his mother would measure them against the doorframe in their bedroom. Caroline smiled. She had been marking their heights there since they were old enough to stand. Robin chimed in that she wanted to be measured too. Caroline knew why there was suddenly all this interest in being measured. The neighborhood kids had been bragging about how tall they'd gotten, so of course her kids wanted to know too. Caroline told Robin to stand against the door jamb and carefully marked her height with a pencil. When Robin stepped away, it looked like she had grown a full inch since they'd last measured her. Caroline wrote the date on the jamb as Robin grinned. Then it was Andrew's turn. But after she measured him and Andrew stepped away, it looked like he had barely grown at all. Andrew frowned, looking at his sister's mark with a tinge of jealousy. Caroline assured him he would grow by next month, but she knew this was unusual for a 4-year-old kid. He should be growing like a weed, and so she decided she would make an appointment with the pediatrician in the morning, just to make sure nothing was wrong. But later that week, Caroline felt frustrated as she paced her kitchen, listening while Andrew's pediatrician explained over the phone that Andrew was not growing because of the pandemic. The stress of all the isolation and fear was negatively affecting Andrew's growth, and unfortunately, because they were still in the pandemic, there really wasn't much they could do. They should just wait it out for a few months. But as she hung up the phone, she felt certain that something was wrong with Andrew, and it had nothing to do with COVID-19. In early 2021, about 9 months after Andrew first started experiencing these sudden bouts of extreme pain, Caroline took him back to his pediatrician for a follow-up. She let Andrew walk ahead of her into the office. She intentionally trailed behind him a little so she could watch his stride. She saw he was dragging his left foot instead of picking it up and actually stepping with it. He'd been doing this whole past week. It was like his right foot was doing all the walking and his left foot was just along for the ride. At this point, it was another symptom to add to the list. Over the past few months, Andrew had been having headaches and meltdowns again. Besides that, he seemed exhausted all the time. The Motrin still helped somewhat, but Caroline could see him getting more solemn and less playful with each passing day. She knew her baby was in pain, and it had to be due to something other than his narrow palate or the pandemic. Caroline had taken him to several doctors, trying to get some answers. A neurologist had told her that Andrew had migraines, while an ear, nose, and throat doctor still believed her son was having breathing issues while sleeping, and so he likely couldn't fall into a deep, undisturbed sleep, which explained why he was so tired. But to Caroline, none of these doctors were addressing the root problem. She felt like each doctor was focusing on one single symptom, but nobody was taking a step back to see the whole picture. What was the underlying condition or disease that was causing all these symptoms? And until somebody could put all the puzzle pieces together, Andrew would be the one suffering. But no matter how many times she tried to communicate this with all the doctors and specialists, it was like nobody seemed to understand. Caroline felt like she was losing her mind, but all she could do was just keep going to more doctors. And so she'd taken Andrew back to his pediatrician's office, hoping maybe he might finally have a real answer for her. While the pediatrician measured Andrew's height and weight, Caroline went through all of Andrew's symptoms. She expected the doctor to offer some kind of overarching explanation. Instead, he just stood upright and told her there was good news. Andrew had grown a bit since his last appointment. Caroline supposed that was good, but the rest of Andrew's symptoms showed no improvement whatsoever. And on the whole, Andrew wasn't feeling good. He was still in pain. And now there was this lazy foot issue. She wanted to know how they could start actively helping her son instead of just tracking all his symptoms. The pediatrician suggested that Caroline put her son in physical therapy to correct his foot imbalance. He promised to write a referral. Caroline thanked him, though secretly she felt overwhelmed by how many appointments this would likely add to their already doctor-heavy calendar. But it just felt like there was nothing else she could do. She had to go through with it. So she smiled and promised the doctor she would get Andrew into therapy soon. Later that week, while Andrew was going through his physical therapy routine, Caroline, who was in the room watching him, felt uneasy. Andrew's therapist, Miss Ashley, was walking Andrew through an examination. Caroline smiled as Andrew walked around the room with a determined look on his face. Miss Ashley took notes and told him he was doing a great job. Then Miss Ashley asked him to sit cross-legged on the floor. Andrew tried, but he couldn't quite get his legs to cross over one another. One leg would bend, but he couldn't bend his other leg enough to sit upright. Before long, he got frustrated and told Miss Ashley he couldn't do it. Miss Ashley said that was okay, and then they moved on to other activities. After his session was over, Andrew came running over to his mom, and Caroline scooped him up. She let him rest his head on her shoulder, and then Miss Ashley came over and explained that Andrew might have a congenital condition called Chiari malformation. That's when a part of the brain, called the cerebellum, bulges through an opening at the back of the skull, right where the skull joins the spinal canal. The bulge puts pressure on the cerebellum and the spinal cord. It can cause severe headaches, scoliosis, and sleep apnea, which is when breathing becomes interrupted during sleep. If Andrew did have a Chiari malformation, he could need surgery. The thought sent a shiver through Caroline. She never thought that Andrew might need to be cut open. She hated picturing it, and she had no idea how she was going to explain it to him. The following winter, in 2022, Caroline was in Andrew's bedroom helping him into his pajamas, the same pair of red flannel pajamas that he'd been wearing for 2 years now. It felt like his sister Robin outgrew her clothes every few months, but Andrew hadn't needed new pajamas or t-shirts since before COVID. Andrew was 6 years old now, but he still looked like he was closer to 4, and this evening he was throwing a tantrum like a bona fide toddler. But Caroline didn't blame him. After dinner, she and Brian had taken Andrew out for ice cream and broke the news. Because of what was going on with him, he had to quit his hockey team. The skating was causing too much pain in his knees and back. It was just too much for his underdeveloped body. At first, Caroline just felt heartbroken for making Andrew so sad. But now, she was so frustrated she was becoming angry at all the doctors. She was tired of having to tell Andrew that nobody knew why his body was failing him. The latest theory, that Andrew had Chiari malformation, wasn't right either. Andrew had tested negative for the condition last year. Since then, Caroline and Brian had taken their son to countless more specialists. A new pediatrician for a second opinion, a pediatric internist, even an adult internist, just in case they found something different. In total, Andrew had seen 17 different doctors over the last 3 years. But all those doctors were still stuck in a cycle of treating his symptoms individually. Caroline finally got Andrew into bed, though it broke her heart to leave him red-faced and tear-streaked, his little arms wrapped around his favorite stuffed animal. She went downstairs and started scrolling on her phone just to decompress. A Facebook friend had posted an article that looked interesting about a new artificial intelligence software called ChatGPT. You could ask it any question, no matter how complex, and it would scan the whole internet in a matter of seconds to generate an answer. People were using it to create marketing plans for their companies, to write blog posts, and to make mashups like fairy tales written in the style of a mafia movie, or resignation letters if they were written by famous TV characters. It seemed like a fun way to spend an hour, so Caroline started messing around with ChatGPT. When Brian came into the living room and sat down next to her on the sofa, she read him some of the funniest mashups it had made. Brian laughed and then joked that she should try to use it to diagnose Andrew. Caroline laughed dismissively, but then she wondered. It was a long shot, but why not? Maybe ChatGPT would find some rare, obscure disease that most specialists had never heard of. Or maybe it would unearth some clue, some pivotal question to ask that would help one of his doctors see the whole picture. The worst that could happen was nothing, really. So Caroline started typing all of Andrew's symptoms into ChatGPT. She even went and got her copy of medical notes from an MRI he'd gotten and typed them in, line by line. It was a tedious process, especially doing it on her phone, but eventually when she was done, she hit enter and waited. A few moments later, the little text box started suggesting possible answers, but they were all conditions that Andrew had already been tested for. Caroline's heart sank. She felt stupid for thinking this brand new internet AI chat box could magically diagnose her child, but then she realized she actually had left out one of his symptoms, the fact that he could no longer sit cross-legged. She told ChatGPT to redo the search, including that symptom, and within moments, it suggested a condition that she'd never heard of, and none of Andrew's doctors had ever mentioned it either. But as she started reading the symptoms of this condition aloud, Brian sat up straight, his eyes going wide. He ran to get his laptop, and Caroline started researching on her phone. Eventually, she found a Facebook group for families living with and caring for those with this condition, and to her surprise, their stories were nearly identical to Andrew's. A week later, Caroline was bursting with anticipation as she sat next to Andrew in a brand new doctor's office. They were waiting to see Dr. Hannah Gordon, a pediatric neurosurgeon. Caroline had brought a packet of research with her and had it waiting on her lap for when the doctor came in. She hoped that by the end of the appointment, Dr. Gordon would be able to officially diagnose Andrew and that Caroline would finally know what was wrong with her son. When Dr. Gordon finally came into the exam room, Caroline introduced herself and explained that usually she was not one to surf the internet and self-diagnose, but she'd actually found some compelling evidence online, and then she handed over the research packet she'd compiled and she watched the doctor read over it. When Dr. Gordon laid eyes on Andrew's MRI scans, she smiled and told Caroline that she was fairly certain she did know how to help Andrew. Dr. Gordon explained that Andrew was suffering from a condition called tethered cord syndrome, the same condition that ChatGPT had identified. The spinal cord runs like a cable through the bones that make up the spine, from the base of the skull to the tailbone. However, in rare cases, the spinal cord improperly attaches itself to something inside the bones of the spinal column. As a result, the spinal cord's movement is limited. In short, it gets stuck. Andrew's spinal cord was stuck to one of those growing spinal bones, causing him extreme pain and all his other symptoms. It was also why he couldn't sit cross-legged, a symptom that's so common among people with tethered cord syndrome that ChatGPT recognized the pattern. Caroline believes that ChatGPT was able to diagnose Andrew because it was doing the very thing she had spent years asking doctors to do. It took a step back and considered all of Andrew's symptoms, instead of picking and choosing or focusing on them one by one. Luckily for Andrew, he was able to undergo surgery to detach his spinal cord from where it was stuck. Once the tension was gone, Andrew's symptoms soon disappeared, and he went back to his happy-go-lucky self. For real this time.
Take a trip to Hawaii, there's a good chance you'll visit the beautiful Rainbow Falls on the eastern side of the Big Island. But if you travel less than a mile upstream of those falls, you'll find an equally beautiful attraction that far less people know about, and it's called the Boiling Pots. 10,000 years ago, after a volcanic eruption, lava was flowing down the side of the mountain when it entered the Wailuku River. As the lava gradually cooled, the river water flowing all around it wound up carving out these standalone pools of water that were connected by a series of small waterfalls. These pools collectively make up the boiling pots, and they get their name because periodically the water in these pools appears to be boiling. Tourists at the boiling pots are allowed to look at the water from a safe distance on this cement overlook, but under no circumstances are allowed to actually enter the water. In 2015, Jolie Ricewig was a 62-year-old woman living in Kona, Hawaii, which is on the western side of the island. There, she owned a bed and breakfast whose main allure was that guests at this bed and breakfast got to go on these fun adventure tours with Jolie all over the island. And they almost always involved paddleboarding or swimming, because Jolie was an avid outdoors person and a very talented swimmer and swim instructor, and so felt comfortable leading these types of excursions. On September 14th of that year, Jolie brought one of her male guests from her bed and breakfast out for an adventure tour at the boiling pots. She would have known that it was an off-limits area for swimmers because there were signs up everywhere saying as much, but Jolie wasn't planning to swim in the boiling pots. Instead, she was planning to float on them on inflatable rafts. And so she and this man climbed aboard their respective rafts and began paddling around one of the upper pools, taking in the incredible view of this natural phenomenon. As they were relaxing, suddenly there was this rush of water that came tumbling over the fall that dumped down into the pool they were in. It was a flash flood, and before Jolie and this man could swim outside of the pool and get to safety, the water under them began to churn violently and actually thrust them over the edge down into the next pool. And as soon as they hit the water, they had fallen off of their raft. So now they're swimming in the water, and they're feeling a current pulling them down and pulling them forward towards the next lip into the next pool. And so they both began desperately swimming towards the edge. Jolie actually grabbed the man and helped push him up and out to safety. And as soon as he was on land, he turned around to grab her, but she wasn't there. And so he's looking around, and all he can see is her raft floating on the surface being taken down into the rapids. And so he thinks, okay, she must have fallen into the next pool. And so on the side of the waterway, he runs down and he's looking into the next pool, the next pool, the next pool, and she's nowhere to be found. And after a few minutes of looking and not knowing where she was, he called the authorities. They came out and they launched this huge search for her, but despite searching the entirety of the boiling pots and all the way downstream, there was no sign of her. And after looking for an entire week, they never found anything. It was like she just disappeared, and so they turned the search off. As devastating as this was for the family to not have closure about what happened to Jolie, this was not a surprising outcome. In fact, it was almost an expected outcome considering why the boiling pots are off limits to swimmers. Each of the pools of water that make up the boiling pots is a deep, nearly vertical shaft of water, and at the bottom of it are these entrances to these underground tunnels, and these entrances are big enough for a person to slip inside of. And these tunnels are not short. They go on for a long ways in all different directions. In a flash flood scenario, that increased water that's flowing down the boiling pots creates this unbelievable current that inside of each of these pools is pulling straight down, which gives the water the impression that it's boiling, because basically the water's tumbling over as it's being filtered up and down inside of this vertical shaft. And so if you get grabbed by this current, it's going to pull you down and into one of these tunnels, and you won't get out again unless the current releases you. And so Jolie, after helping her guest get out of the water to safety, she was pulled down and into one of these tunnels, and she was held there for 5 months until finally the current released her and her remains were spotted just below the pots in a tide pool.
Our next story is called Out on a Limb.
On the evening of March 25th, 2017, a 25-year-old farmer named Akbar Solabiro was harvesting palm fruit at the local oil palm grove near his tiny village in Indonesia. Now, the way Akbar would do this is he would use this long curved pole and he would prod at the bright red fruit in the tree, knocking it to the ground, and then he would gather it up, put it in his cart, and wheel it back home to be sold for palm oil. Now, on this night, Akbar was actually working later than usual because his wife and kids were out of town for a couple of days visiting family, and so there was no real reason to head back home because the house was empty. But Akbar was actually just fine with that because there was tons of ripe fruit, and so staying late would be quite profitable. But after a while, when the sun had finally set and it was getting difficult to actually even see the fruit in the tree, Akbar knew he really needed to leave soon because this area at night was actually not safe. And so Akbar gathered up the remainder of his fruit on the ground, he put his pole in the cart as well, and he began quickly making his way back home. Later that evening, one of Akbar's neighbors was asleep in their bed inside of their home when they woke up suddenly to the sound of something out in the jungle, not far from where Akbar had been harvesting palm fruit. And so this neighbor, when they sat up, they couldn't really tell what the sound was. It almost sounded like a stifled scream or maybe some animal that was fighting with another animal. But as the neighbor sat there straining their ears to try to hear it again, they didn't. All they heard was normal sounds coming from the outside. And so the neighbor decided that the sound they heard must have been a cat or maybe a monkey. And, whatever it was, it couldn't have been a big deal. And so this neighbor went back to sleep. The following evening, so 24 hours later, another one of Akbar's neighbors walked outside of their home to begin the walk over to the jungle to harvest palm fruit. And when they went outside, normally around this time, Akbar would be coming outside as well, because these two often went to the grove together. But, this neighbor is looking and Akbar's not outside, and he looks up at Akbar's house and it's dark and quiet. And so this neighbor's thinking to themselves, where is Akbar? I know he worked late last night. I didn't hear him come in. And come to think of it, I haven't seen him all day. And now, of course, I'm not seeing him as well. And so this neighbor, feeling concerned about Akbar, walked over and knocked on his door, but nobody answered. And so really starting to think that something could be wrong with Akbar, this neighbor went to Akbar's uncle's house. And when Akbar's uncle came to the door, this neighbor explained what was going on and they're concerned that, something could have happened to Akbar. And so the uncle and this neighbor would go back over to Akbar's home and they would actually try the door. It was locked. They looked inside the windows and it looked like no one was in there. And they also noticed that where Akbar typically kept his cart that he would transport his fruit in, it wasn't there either, which made them think, Akbar must still be out somewhere with this cart because this cart is very important to him. And so ultimately, the uncle, after seeing the state of his nephew's home, he agreed with this neighbor that, something was wrong here. And if they wanted to find Akbar, they really needed to get together a search party right now and go looking for him. So the uncle contacted the leaders of the village, and they, in turn, rounded up all the able-bodied men in the village, and they all got together with headlamps and flashlights and machetes and knives, and then all together, they began walking away from the village into the jungle in the direction of this palm grove, which was the place that Akbar had been last. And so this big group of men, they get inside the jungle, and they begin walking along this path, which was the most likely path that Akbar would have taken to go to the palm grove and also to return from the palm grove. And as they're walking, the sun is starting to set, it's getting dark, and the animals in the jungle, they're all making noises and kind of yelling at this group as they're moving through. And this group, they're shining their light around looking for any sign of Akbar, but there wasn't any. They were calling his name out, there was no response. And then at some point, as they got closer to the palm grove, they noticed there were a couple of bright red fruits, palm fruits, that had clearly been recently harvested that were scattered on the trail. And so the group began to fan out in this area, thinking that, oh my goodness, Akbar must be somewhere nearby. Maybe there was some sort of accident and he's fallen somewhere, or just something's happened to him, but he's got to be in this area. And so the group began fanning out off the trail, kind of hacking their way through all the underbrush. And then suddenly, one of the men, after he hacked through a particularly dense stretch of the jungle, he looked down and saw something and began to scream, and he raised his machete and began running forward. As far as we can tell, this is what happened to Akbar. The previous night, after Akbar had decided, it wasn't safe to be in the jungle at night, he needed to leave, and so he gathered up all of his things and he began walking along that path where the search party would find all that fruit scattered on the trail. And so he's walking along this path, and he thinks he's alone, he thinks he's okay, but in reality, he wasn't. He was being watched and followed very closely from something up in the trees. And so as Akbar moved along, this thing was kind of trailing him and seeing what he was going to do. And then at some point, this thing up in the trees began moving its way down closer and closer to Akbar. It was a 23-foot long reticulated python. It was a massive snake. And this snake came down and launched an attack on Akbar, grabbing the back of his neck with its powerful jaws. And as soon as the snake clamped down on Akbar's neck, he let out a stifled scream, which was the scream that had woken up that other neighbor who sat up in bed wondering what that was. That was Akbar screaming out. But that was the only sound Akbar could make, because immediately the snake wrapped itself all around Akbar and squeezed him tight. And after crushing Akbar, breaking almost every bone in his body, the snake relaxed and then slithered off of Akbar. And so Akbar fell to the ground and was either dead or very close to death. And at this point, the snake opened up its jaws and positioned itself right in front of Akbar's head. And then it began kind of slithering itself forward, consuming Akbar head first. And the way pythons do this is they don't really chew on their victim. Instead, they kind of put their mouth over the top of whatever they're going to consume, and they kind of undulate and walk their bodies forward, driving the victim deeper and deeper into their body until they are completely consumed. And so the next night, when one of the members of the search party had gone off the trail and began hacking away and then saw something and charged after it with his machete, what he was seeing was the python, who very clearly had a person inside of its stomach. You could see the outline of the person. And so this search party member ran forward and hacked the snake, opened it up, and there was Akbar fully dressed and deceased inside of the snake.
The next and final story of today's episode is called The Popelick Monster. While she was in high school in Dayton, Ohio, Raquel Bain became known as a bit of a thrill seeker, primarily because she would do something called car surfing, which is exactly what it sounds like. She would climb onto the exterior of cars and hold on to the roof while somebody else drove it around. In addition to seeking out these physical thrills, Raquel was also drawn to psychological ones, like going to places that were supposedly haunted and seeing if she could spook herself. Following high school, Raquel kind of calmed down and became less of the wild teenager she was known for being, and instead she really focused on building a life and a career for herself. And so she would go to college and she would earn her degree in surgical technologies. And then by 2009, she was employed full-time as a surgical assistant in Dayton. Also around that time, she had her first child, a son who she adored. But despite creating this life full of stereotypically adult, mature things like having a career and starting a family, deep down, Raquel was still very much the thrill-seeking wild teenager she was back in high school. But as an adult, she just never had time to go seek out those thrills. So, with that in mind, fast forward to April of 2016. By this point, Raquel is 26 years old, and that month, a very rare weekend popped up where Raquel did not have to work, and she didn't have any childcare responsibilities. And so, wanting to take advantage of this free time, Raquel asked her boyfriend, 41-year-old David Nee, if he would join her on a road trip that weekend to Louisville, Kentucky, where Raquel wanted to check out the infamously scary Waverly Hills Sanatorium. Back in the 1900s, Waverly Hills was a place where tuberculosis patients were sent. Tuberculosis, or TB for short, is an infection of the lungs, and it can be deadly. Today, there's a cure for it, but back in the early 1900s, there wasn't. And so most of the people who went to Waverly Hills died there, and usually very slowly and painfully, and in total isolation from their families, because in virtue of being sent to Waverly Hills, they were effectively being quarantined to stop the spread of the disease. Waverly Hills would eventually shut down permanently in 1961 because by that point the cure had been found, and after it shut down, the building basically just sat there. Nobody else came in and turned it into anything else. And so this building is basically abandoned, and lots of people began sneaking in to see what it was like in there, and a shocking number of these trespassers reported seeing ghosts inside.
Today, the sanatorium is still very much in the same condition it was left in, but the Waverly Hills Historical Society has stepped in and made it very hard for people to sneak into the building. However, knowing people do want to go in and look around, the Historical Society has begun offering guided tours of the sanatorium. And these tours are given exclusively at night to increase the spooky effect. And so David, who had only been dating Raquel for a month when she asked him to come with her to the sanatorium, he was not really that keen on doing this. It did not really appeal to him to go walking around this totally terrifying place. But he could tell it was important to Raquel, she was really excited about it, and so he agreed to go. A few days later, on the late afternoon of April 23rd, the new couple left Raquel's place, they climbed into the car, and they began driving south. 3 hours later, they arrived in Louisville and they stopped to get dinner. And then after they were done eating, they looked at the time and realized it was only about 6:45 p.m. and the tour they had scheduled at the sanatorium was not until 10 p.m. So they had a few hours to kill. And before David could suggest anything, Raquel already had the perfect idea of how they should kill this time. She told David that earlier that day, she had learned about a spot just outside of Louisville that might actually be more terrifying than the sanatorium they had come all this way to see. And so Raquel wanted to spend these few hours checking out this new spooky spot. This spooky spot was a rickety old, narrow, abandoned-looking bridge called the Pope Lick Trestle. It's located just east of downtown Louisville in this heavily wooded area. The bridge is about 800 feet long, and at its highest point, right in the middle of the bridge, it's about 90 to 100 feet off the ground. And this bridge connects the tops of two of the bigger rolling hills in the area. But the bridge's physical appearance has nothing to do with why it's considered so spooky. The reason the Pope Lick Trestle has become a central part of Kentucky folklore is because locals say there is a monster called the Pope Lick Monster that lives underneath the bridge. It's half goat, half man, and when anyone is near this bridge at night, this monster is supposed to come out from underneath this bridge, and then what happens next is very ambiguous. It kind of depends on who you're talking to. But generally speaking, once the Pope Lick monster has emerged and it sees you, you're dead. Now, how you die ranges from the monster leaping out and attacking you with an axe to the monster using some sort of mind control to lure you up onto the bridge where you leap off. David, after hearing this suggestion, was again not really that keen to go do this really terrifying sounding thing, but seeing the excitement in his girlfriend's face, he agreed to go. And so the two left the restaurant, they climbed back in the car, and they drove for about 15 or 20 minutes to the Pope Lick Trestle Bridge. The bridge actually passed over a relatively main road, and so the couple parked just off the side of this main road. And then once they were outside, they began looking for a pathway up this hillside to get up to the bridge. And very quickly, they found a well-worn dirt path that snaked up the side of this wooded hillside that looked very much like it would bring them up to the bridge. So with Raquel in front and David behind her, they began walking up this dirt path. And as they're walking, they start to see signs that clearly say, "No trespassing." But they ignore them because they're looking at this path thinking, okay, lots of people clearly come up here, so we've got to be okay. And so they keep on walking up this path and they're getting closer and closer to the top of this hill where they think it's going to connect with this bridge. And right as they're getting close, they see there's this huge chain link fence, this 8-foot tall chain link fence with barbed wire across the top that extends in either direction out of view. And so the couple walks up to this fence and there are more signs that say no trespassing, private property, and there are additional warning signs saying that what is on the other side of this fence is also just plain dangerous, so turn around and leave. But as Raquel and David are staring at all these signs and this fence, they see, not far from the path, somebody had clearly bent two of the fence posts and created a narrow gap in the fence that you could slip through. And so from David and Raquel's perspective, that looked like the way other trespassers must have found their way up to the bridge, and so it must be safe. And so once again, the couple disregarded all the warnings. They made their way over to this gap in the fence, they both slipped through, and they kept on walking up the hill. Just a couple of minutes later, they reached this clearing, which was at the top of this hill, and once they were in this clearing, they were able to turn, and they could actually see the bridge. It was only a couple hundred feet away from them. And it was totally intimidating. By this point, it's totally dark out, and from their perspective, all they see is this very narrow bridge that they know is 100 feet off the ground at certain points, and they can see there's no guardrails on either side of this bridge. It would have almost looked like a tightrope kind of extending off into the darkness. But even if the couple was really intimidated by the sight of this bridge and with all these warning signs before it, they were able to put their fear aside and just keep on going. And so with David now in the lead and Raquel behind him, they walked the couple of hundred feet over to the start of this narrow bridge, and when they got there, without actually stepping onto the bridge, David came to a stop, he turned around to face Raquel, and he gestured for her to come stand next to him so they could take a selfie with the bridge in the background. Because David at this point is thinking, we're not going to go on this bridge. We're just going to look at this bridge, take some pictures, and then we'll go. But Raquel, who he's looking at, gesturing to come stand with him, just walks right past him onto the bridge and takes several steps out onto this narrow, rickety old thing, and then she stops, turns around, and gestures for David to come with her and walk across the entire bridge. And David, again, is having his second thoughts, but he sees Raquel wants to do this, and so he agrees to go. After they had walked about 100, maybe 200 feet across this bridge, the two of them just started laughing because it was totally exhilarating what they were doing. Not so much the quest for the Pope-like monster, but rather the very real risk they were taking walking this tightrope bridge in the middle of the night. The couple would continue to very cautiously but quickly make their way across this bridge, and when they reached about the halfway point, when they were at the highest point from the ground, the bridge itself begins to shake. And then from behind them, they hear this loud grinding sound. And so the couple, they whip their heads around and they see there are these two bright glowing lights that are looking right at them all the way on the start of the bridge. And they realize it's a train. When Raquel and David walked up that dirt path and snuck through the fence and reached the top of the hill and could actually see the Pope-like trestle bridge, they would have also seen the train tracks in the hillside that clearly extended onto the Pope-like trestle and went across the bridge. This was a train bridge. They would have seen that. But it's assumed that the couple, who didn't live in the area and so didn't know much about the Pope-like trestle, it's assumed they thought, well, this is a train bridge, but it's got to be abandoned. It certainly looks abandoned, and it does. It looks totally old. It does not look active, even though it is. Or the couple thought, well, this is just an old train bridge. It might be active, but surely no train is going to come through anytime soon. We can get across the bridge before a train arrives. But, of course, they were wrong. When the couple turned around and saw these two headlights bearing down on them, they quickly realized they would not be able to outrun this train. The train's clearly trying to stop. It has seen them. It's hitting its brakes. It's sounding its horn, but it's just clearly moving too quickly. So they cannot run to the other side to safety. And because this bridge was meant for a single train to pass through, there was no other track they could just jump onto to avoid being hit. And there were no walkways on either side of this railway. And so literally all they had was the track that this train was going to cross over, and they were on it. And so with no other choices, David yells to Raquel that they have to climb down and hang off the side of this bridge. Now, there were these wooden slats that ran underneath the rails. They ran perpendicular to the rails, and these wooden slats kind of extended off the edge of the bridge on either side just a couple of inches. And so in theory, if you were holding onto the outside of one of these wooden slats and kind of dangling off the edge of the bridge, a train could cross those tracks and not run over your hands or fingers. You would just have to hold on that whole time as the train is rumbling through. And so David, he flops down onto his stomach and he's trying to lower himself as fast as he can as this train is getting closer and closer. And he's yelling for Raquel to do the same thing, but she's not really moving very quickly. And finally, David, he gets in position. He's hanging off the edge of this bridge on these wooden slats and he sees Raquel. She's not quite there. And then the train comes flying through. It strikes Raquel and sends her flying off the bridge to the ground below. David would somehow manage to hold on the whole time as this train went past him. And then once the train had passed him, he pulled himself back up onto the tracks. He ran the rest of the way across the bridge. He went down that hillside. And when he found Raquel, it was immediately apparent that she was deceased. In the end, the railroad was not issued any citations or sued for negligence. It was determined they did their due diligence by setting up that 8-foot-tall barbed wire fence with all those signs telling people to stay back and warning people about the hazards of going past this fence. It was actually David who got in trouble for this tragedy. He was cited and charged with a felony of unlawfully disrupting and or delaying a train causing financial damages. He would plead to a lesser charge of trespassing and would be fined $2,300. Shockingly, this tragedy is just one of many that have occurred on the Poplick Trestle Bridge. Since the bridge's construction in the 1800s, there have been dozens of people who have died on this bridge. And several of these deaths, many of them fairly recent, the last 20 or so years, have occurred under the same conditions as Raquel's. People went looking for the Poplick monster and then were struck by a train.
Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts, Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, and Run Fool. Just search for Ballin Studios wherever you get your podcasts and you'll find them all.